You're in charge during this crisis, Mike. What would you do differently?
What I would do differently is I would make sure that I would be slightly more honest about the science, because I keep hearing they're following the science. And my first question would be to the scientists, what on earth are you doing? Why do you keep changing your minds? Why did you tell me in February that it wasn't a good idea to quarantine anybody coming in from other countries? And now you're telling me it's a great idea, despite the fact that we've passed the peak of infection. And I'd start giving the scientists a much harder time and not relying upon everything that they say, because if they're so smart, why do they keep changing them? Why do they keep changing their minds?
Good point. Okay, let's get specific now, Mike Graham. I know you have your independent republic, but you are Prime Minister now. Who do you hire as your deputy or your first Secretary of State? It's not Julia Hartley-Brewer, but who are you going for?
Well, this is where it gets very controversial, because I'm going to bring a foreigner in. I'm going to bring in Marta Malagon, my producer, who, quite frankly, is the cleverest woman in the Western world. I've never met anybody cleverer. She can control me for a start. So I reckon if she can do that, she'd make a fantastic deputy prime minister.
She's sort of your deputy already. Yes, that makes perfect sense. Okay, well, look, you can hire...
She kind of is.
People say the chief of staff, though, that role is actually the most important for any prime minister, because we've had the likes of Alistair Campbell and Dominic Cummings and Robbie Gibb, people like that. So who is your chief of staff in your administration?
I think it might have to be Katie Perrior, the woman who was Boris Johnson's right hand when he was mayor of London, and who also worked for Theresa May in Downing Street. She comes across as all sugar and spice, but I can tell you, I know some things about Katie Perrior, and she can handle herself very well in any situation.
No, she's a genius. She's a political genius, and also she's got a good read of you. She could keep a handle on you, Mike, because you spent all of those hours in the studio together where she had to keep you in control. Okay, so you can bring back one former UK Prime Minister, one former US President. I don't care which era they're from, Mike. I don't care if they're dead or alive, and they're going to join your cabinet. Who do you go for?
Well, it's got to be one great team who, between them, managed to destroy the old Soviet Union. It's got to be Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, because not only did they epitomise the great kind of, combination of the good things about Britain and America, they were absolutely at the peak of their professions at the time when they ran both their countries. They brought both countries out of recession. They brought joy and honour and pride back to both countries. And I think they would be brilliant at taking on China and the rest of the world.
Yeah, they were pretty good at ending wars too, weren't they? So that's a good idea. Okay, the current cabinet, Mike. Yeah. I know there's been a lot of debate about whether they're strong enough to deal with such a crisis. But out of the ministers there at the moment, who would you choose to keep in position?
Well, do you know, I was watching Rishi Sunak a little bit earlier on, answering questions from a load of doddery old people from the House of Lords. And I think Rishi Sunak has played an absolute blinder. For someone who hasn't been around for very long, he's showing himself to be a pretty, wise head on some pretty young shoulders. And I think he's a possible future leader of this country anyway. So I think he'd definitely stay where he is.
Who would you sack? Anyone got to go?
I'd sack old Robert Generic. Who's not very good, and the other bloke, Eustace, who I call useless. I'd get rid of those two. But I quite like Dominic Raab. I think he's doing okay. And I think Matt Hancock's doing a fine job as well. So I would keep those two.
He might be the sacrificial lamb, though, potentially, for this crisis, Mike.
Yes.
Now, look,
right.
What happens to the British Broadcasting Corporation in your administration?
I take both my hands, I put them on the rug on which they stand, and I pull it away from them. And I say to them that you have no right any longer to charge a license fee. You are now a subscription-only based station. You can run some TV stations and some radio stations, but you cannot run 61 local radio stations. You cannot run 10 different television channels. You cannot make Strictly Come Dancing. And you can do what you're supposed to do, and that's be a public service. And the first thing you do is you fire Laura Kunsberg.
And what happens to the royal family, and specifically... do you have a role for your favourites, Harry and Meg?
Well, Harry and Meghan, I think, are just going to be a kind of stand-up comedy act for the rest of time until such time. I was saying today that fence they've put up around the £15 million villa in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, is not to keep out the prying eyes of the public, but it's to keep Harry in. Because pretty soon, I think he's going to take a run for it.
He's going to say, I'm out, I need to escape.
I'm out. I've had enough, So I'm a great believer in the Queen. I think the Queen's wonderful. Not so sure what happens after that, really. Charles is all right and William's all right. but I'm not entirely certain that I want to see the monarchy continuing when the Queen finishes up.
There you go. 5 minutes in the administration
is that
of
it?
Mike Graham. I think it's going to be a very fun place, Mike.